right, well, thank you, and welcome everyone to the next presentation in our Working Tools seminar series. My name is Andrew Martindale, and I want to extend a warm welcome to you on behalf of Eric Simons and Allison Wiley as organizers of our series, Community-Facing Data Management Platforms for Indigenous University Partnerships. And if you've missed any of our previous talks, there's some real great ones in there. In fact, they're all pretty spectacular. They are available as recordings on our website. I want to begin by acknowledging that UBC Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. The land it is situated on has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and of UBC's Green College for helping us organize this series. Please keep your microphones and video feeds turned off. And if you've got a question or comment during the presentation, please add it to the chat or let us know that you'd like to ask something. Eric Simons will compile these for the discussion after the presentation. You're welcome to put your question out for everybody or just send it privately to Eric. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce my colleagues Stephanie Huddleston and Keisha Supernant to you. Stephanie is an archaeologist with long experience working with Indigenous communities in British Columbia, including the Katzie First Nation. She was a CRM archaeologist with Clianza Consulting for many years before moving to her current position as the Culture, Language, and Heritage Coordinator at Metlakatla First Nation, a post that includes, among other things, mediating the relationship between the nation and universities and, of course, people like me. Keisha Supernant is a member of the Métis Nation and an associate professor at the University of Alberta, where she is the director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, among many other roles. Keisha is a leading Indigenous voice in archaeology across the world, and I'm going to draw your attention to her new book, Archaeologies of the Heart. It is an exploration of, and I'm going to quote from their introduction, an archaeology that speaks to the whole person, our intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and physical selves. This book has become one of my favorites, one that I find I keep returning to and gaining insight from. I'm going to put a link to this volume in the chat. And as many of you know, I'm an archaeologist at UBC, and I've been working in partnership with the 9 tribes of the Tsimshian, represented by the Metlakatla and Tlaquelam's First Nations, for much of my time as an archaeologist, relationships that have provided me with an extraordinary education. Our paper today is titled Tasa, a community-facing spatial archive for heritage data. And I'm going to invite Stephanie to get us started. Stephanie. First, I have to share the screen. There we go. Success.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, first, before we begin, I would really like to thank Andrew, Allison, and Eric for all of their hard work coordinating this workshop series. And I really appreciate the invitation to be invited to present today with Andrew and Keisha. It's really an honor. And so for those that don't know, Andrew kind of gave a bit of a brief introduction there. I've been working for Metlakatla in my current capacity as the Cultural, Language, and Heritage Coordinator for the past couple of years. And part of my role and mandate is to help develop a new Cultural, Language, and Heritage Department. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. I moved up north to Prince Rupert from Surrey, BC about 8 years ago. And obviously working in a capacity of CRM archaeology. And prior to that, I worked with Katzie First Nation as they were getting their development corporation going, which is now, I believe it's now named Katzie Development Limited Partnership. So that's a bit about my history there, working in archaeology. So I guess, Andrew, we could probably move on to the next slide. So since working for Metlakatla, we've had many questions about how to appropriately develop data management systems that can help us work more effectively with government, researchers, proponents, and community members. Right now, it's a big issue, how we move forward with this. So for today's discussion, I was going to just start with a bit of an introduction about the Metlakatla community, followed by another discussion how we currently manage various types of cultural and archaeological data. And though we have existing systems in place, our needs continue to expand to answer internal questions that we have and to facilitate cultural research, as well as responding to external pressures from industry and government. And I'll touch on some of the variables that as a community we must consider to develop something new in the future to support the nation's work towards data sovereignty. Keisha will follow the presentation, providing a discussion evaluating the pros and cons of knowledge co-production and data management in the context of academic research, and how we can work to decolonize current research expectations and assumptions to ensure data is collected and managed responsibly. It's important to recognize the limitations of the data you collect and the platforms that you use. And then Andrew will follow, introducing the Tasa system, which he has developed in response to all of his work that he's been conducting in the territory for many years, and working with communities in their response to emerging data needs that they have. And he'll demo the system and evaluate how the system can be expanded. So I think we'll move on to the next slide. So Metlakatla is a Coast Tsimshian community whose ancestors are part of the 9 allied tribes. Lakwalam shares the same ancestry, as well as the community of New Metlakatla, Alaska. And this photo here that I have is of one of the beaches in Venn Pass, or Metlakatla Pass, facing the city of Prince Rupert. Across the Prince Rupert Harbor, you can see Prince Rupert off in the distance on Kane Island there. You can go to the next slide, Andrew. Metlakatla territory includes the ancestral lands of the Coast Tsimshian, ranging from the waters of the middle of the Hecate Strait to the west, and to the lands and fresh waters in the east at the Zymotz River near Terrace. And to the south, the territory reaches down through Grenville Channel, and to the north to the headwaters of the Sutton River. The territory encompasses roughly 20,000 square kilometers of land and sea in the Great Bear Rainforest, and is the largest coastal temperate rainforest in the world. The community of Metlakatla is about 7.5 kilometers northwest of Prince Rupert. So you can see on the map here, just a Google Earth image, we have Prince Rupert here on Kane Island, and we have Prince Rupert Harbor, Digby Island, and Metlakatla here on the Tsimshian Peninsula. In Semeliak, Metlakatla means saltwater pass, or where it is calm. That's where it is calm is the more direct translation. And various dialects of Semeliak are now spoken by neighboring Tsimshian communities throughout the Northwest Coast and in New Metlakatla, Alaska. So I'll just flip to the next one. So this is just an aerial photograph of the village in Metlakatla. I just thought I would put this in just for fun. So this is at low tide. And you can see here we have the band office, the health center, and then we also have the hall. In the back, this photo was taken when they were building, I guess we have a ball field and soccer field back here. This is also Mission Point, and this is where the band office sits today, is actually where the William Duncan built his church when everyone resettled here in the post-contact period. So you can see that the village sort of stretches along the coastline, and it also continues here further to the west as well. This old dock doesn't really exist anymore. We actually use the new dock, which is on this far end of the village here, to access the community today. So you can flip to the next slide, Andrew. I just thought I would share this slide as well. Just to give a better sense of community and all of the different cultural activities the community participates in currently. Obviously, this year, we haven't had as many community gatherings, but in sort of before COVID and post-COVID, everyone would get together as frequently as we could for community celebrations. Here's an example of another celebration within the territory at Lake House Lake. We have some other members, youth, and obviously we have folks doing lots of research in the territory. It's a very dynamic place. I just recently hired 2 new staff members for my department. I'm really excited, and we have Rebecca Ryan now working with me, as well as Fanny Nelson, who is also a matriarch as well. So we can go to the next slide, Andrew. So diving into data management, currently Metlakatla, I mean, has been continually expanding over the years. And so we have several different departments and organizations that are data repositories for the community. The Stewardship Society was formed about 7 years or so ago, 8 years I think now, and that was more or less in response to growing pressures on the community in respect to development projects, and obviously many different requests from the provincial and federal government. So each department, each repository has its own mandate for the community, and essentially has really been, each new department has grown in response to these new pressures. So at this point, the Stewardship Society for Metlakatla, I mean, they've been really taking on a lot of community-based research, traditional use data, archaeological data. They respond to referrals with the provincial and federal government and proponents. So that's sort of their main mandate and role. The Metlakatla Lands Department falls under the Governing Council umbrella, and the Lands Department cares for the lands on reserve for the nation at this point, and so they are the repository for all the information for what we learn about the resources on reserve. The Cultural, Language, and Heritage Department, that's the newly formed department that I'm involved with, and essentially this department kind of functions as kind of mediating between all of these different departments on a case-by-case basis. So we've taken on some of the work that the Stewardship Society has previously managed, particularly around archaeological research, but we do collaborate quite frequently together. We also support the Lands Department. This department does fall under the MGC umbrella, the Governing Council umbrella as well. We also have many other departments and partner organizations that we work with as well. So just to give everyone a sense of sort of the breadth of information that the community gathers and how data is sort of separated out, and sometimes it can be siloed. So currently as I was mentioning, research, our partnerships, industry, different pressures have really are what has sort of driven the direction that we've headed in terms of our data management systems. So the Vertice program is one that the Metlakatla Lands Department uses. It's also a spatial archive, so that different land use data can be stored and housed there as well to support, again, the Lands Department. We have the Traditional Use Spatial Archive, which is a GIS-based, again, spatial archive as well. And that's more or less managed under the Stewardship Society. We have another platform that we use to help us manage referrals. It functions similarly to Stolo Connect, but it's not spatially, it's not quite as sophisticated, but it's a place where, again, communications with government, industry, all of that information gets harvested and housed in that system. There's also a heritage app feature that's part of this, and it's something that we haven't really explored just yet in terms of its capacity. I know other communities who work with coastal First Nations have used it for their other heritage, as another form of, archival information can be housed there. We also work with Coast Tracker with CFN too, so there's data that's being gathered by the Guardian program. And we also have, obviously, ongoing research relationships. We're working with Andrew on various archaeological projects, and working with Dr. Ripon Mali at University of Illinois on DNA work in the community. And I didn't mention as well, we're also working with, there's another partnership with SFU through a MyTax program, and it's doing cumulative effects research as well. So essentially, you can just see that you know, managing data within the community can be quite a chore. This is just really trying to give everybody a bit of context in terms of, you know, some of the challenges that we face sometimes when researchers come to us and with a request. So we can maybe pop to the next slide, Andrew. So we have emerging needs in the community. Obviously, we continue to do archaeological research, traditional use research, ethnographic, archival. My department alone is embarking on an archival project right now, really just trying to get a better handle on what we have in the community to again support all of the other work that's going on. You know, we're still exploring better ways to use our existing platforms or to create new platforms to share and manage data, to again support the research, to support referrals, and also my hope is through my own department to kind of expand into community and be able to share some of this knowledge and information more effectively. So we're really just trying to assess at this point, you know, our infrastructure needs. You know, what capacity do we really need? I mean, we have, again, several departments that each have their own mandate and responsibility, but is there a better way of doing this? Do we need to hire more folks? Do we need a data manager? You know, there's all these bigger questions that are going on. We also, you know, server access and space. You know, that's just the general question that we always have. You know, you have all this information, where do we put it? And how much space is needed? And also, where is the server? You know, that's another big question that we ask, because obviously data and information, depending on where it is in the world, I mean, can be subject to different laws and issues of access. And also secure file sharing platforms can we use as well when we're sharing information between different proponents, researchers, and so forth. So, you know, we just have our own questions about future collaboration. And, you know, we're hoping that as we continue to grow and to expand our data management needs, we really want to develop frameworks that really help us develop principled research, support data sovereignty, and governance that respects Metlakatla as a community. So, you know, we're working with Andrew and many other researchers, but, you know, some of the platforms that exist, I mean, to me, they're just, including Tasa, they're really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of where we could be going next. So I think at this point, I will pass on to Keisha to continue.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Tanse, hello everyone. So as Andrew introduced, I'm Keisha Supernant, and I've had the great pleasure of working with Andrew and with Metlakatla for many years. And in fact, Stephanie, your photos of the harbor make me quite sad that we were not able to get out there in this past summer, because usually that's such a way to kind of fill up my need for ocean and forest, and where I am in landlocked Edmonton. I also wanted to just briefly take a moment to acknowledge where I'm coming to you from. So I'm currently on the Zoom call in Amiskwaciy-Waskahigan, also known as Edmonton, Alberta, and this is the territory of Treaty 6 nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So I'm going to pick up from Stephanie's wonderful grounding of us in Metlakatla as a place and Metlakatla's data needs, and talk a little bit briefly about some of the challenges around data management and knowledge co-production and access, and where the limitations exist in some of the tools that have been used by researchers in the past. And that will then set up Andrew to take us through Tasa. So I'm going to move through this relatively quickly to give us some time to demo Tasa. But this is our happy Venn diagram, but this is a graphic to try to talk about the partnerships between Indigenous communities and universities. So, and where some of these different elements map onto these relationships. So the core takeaway here is that there's a lot of data that gets generated in partnerships and also was generated prior to the existence of some of these formal partnerships. And these map out in some interesting ways, looking at how we can support data access, how we can bring collections and archival materials into the conversations, and how this leads to questions of heritage protection and analysis. The key thing here is that we need information to flow across these. We need, not for these things to sit in silos, but that they actually need to move across many of these spaces as represented here. So Andrew, if we could move to the next one, I can get some of the weeds. Fundamentally, data is generated through research, and for a long time, much of this data which was generated through research, often on Indigenous communities, was taken out of communities and brought into institutions. So we're now moving to a different model of one of sharing data and connecting across those communities. And here's some of the core reasons why this is important. First is the idea of transparency and especially accountability. So in the past, research has not always been transparent and certainly not always been accountable to community partners, where much of this information would end up in very inaccessible locations, ones that didn't allow for kind of community oversight and input into that. And many researchers were not held accountable for the results of the research and the outcomes themselves. Being able to share data avoids some of these issues and barriers of gatekeeping, of, you must have access through the university only to be able to actually learn about the materials that are generated through that research, or you have to have specialized knowledge of particular systems or of particular ways of structuring data to be able to actually access this. And we can see this in things like archives, right? In terms of you have to be able to navigate through these spaces, and there's a danger of gatekeeping there. Another issue is ones of being able to understand what is actually in the data, what's missing, or this idea that the data, when it comes into these institutional spaces, can get lost in a certain sense. I certainly know this happens in archaeology, where materials that were generated in the earlier days of archaeology are not always brought back into communities, and then they, not necessarily forgotten, but they aren't sort of engaged with in the contemporary practice as well. Also, when we have this information flow, and when we can bring these data back into community, it can really allow for scholarship within community, right? So that doesn't have to sit within the institutional or disciplinary frames in which it was generated, but actually can inform other parts of scholarship. And I think about this particularly in terms of some of those activities that Stephanie was sharing with us. Are there ways in which previous data from, say, archaeology can inform those revitalization of cultural practice and knowledge as well? And that scholarship that doesn't have to fit into these institutional frames. And fundamentally, this data sharing is at the core of decolonizing academic practice in terms of our relations. And this is everything from being able to ensure that data is accessible, but as we'll see on the next slide, questions around actually co-production of knowledge, because access is sometimes seen as, okay, well, will this give communities access to previous data? But that's only one step in what is a much more important relationship, because the ways in which that knowledge was created in the first place, the structures in which it sits, is mediated by power, by interdisciplinarity. And this is really important because it shows us how just providing access without actually thinking about the structures of that access and how the data themselves can create or recreate or reproduce those sort of colonial ways of thinking is really, really important. So we need to move beyond models of just access, but to ones of actually directionality of research, reciprocity in research, building capacity reciprocally, and then also this idea that we want certain types of outputs. So academia, for example, produces certain types of scholarship, but there may be other ways that we want to support that data can support different forms of output. And this idea that also scholarship has been going on in many Indigenous territories for a very, very long period of time. And we need to make sure that there's a continuity in that and that there's an understanding of the archive of our own research so that we're not forgetting about that, and we're bringing that back into communities from a time where many anthropologists and archaeologists weren't engaged in any kind of reciprocal data sharing and things like that. Also want to make a point here is that this is not about multidisciplinarity necessarily, but this is really about interdisciplinarity. So this is the idea that looking at the ways in which not you have multiple disciplines that sit aside each other, but we're actually breaking down some of those silos of disciplines, right? Looking at those structural inequalities that exist within even the way we shape disciplinary thinking, and moving across rather than in between in many ways. The other point that we really wanted to make is that right now, university-led research provides some possibilities for better relations, but it's not actually ideal because the university still has to mediate that relationship. We have to go through grant funding. We have to write things in particular ways. We have to mobilize knowledge in particular ways. And that still puts the university and university researchers in particular positions, as opposed to allowing truly community-driven work. And so the university is one method of doing that, but it is not always ideal for the community needs, as Stephanie showed us with Metlakatla. Next slide, please, Andrew. The other, of course, element to data sharing and data generation as well is the idea that we need to be attentive to Indigenous protocols. And this is from Musqueam Living Culture and some of the protocols specific to that. This is core, I think you can see across many Indigenous relationships, but of course, different communities will have specific Indigenous protocols that they will relate to the work, but these are some really good foundational principles, right? So one's about listening. So many times as academics are trained to lecture, to instruct, to tell, and we're not always as good as we need to be at listening. And so listening is really the core of this. One of the teachings that I received when I had the great pleasure of working at the First Nations House of Learning, one of the teachings of the house posts is that we have two ears in one mouth, two eyes in one mouth. We should listen and see more than we speak, right? So bringing this to those principles. Showing respect to each other, respect to the data itself, right? I've been thinking a lot about this in my own work. I work with the belongings of my ancestors, showing respect to them, showing respect to the information that is generated as well. At the core of this is also questions of transparency, being transparent, being clear in the communication, asking permission, not forgiveness, asking permission, right? In terms of shifting of that relationship. So this is not about consulting. This is about co-creating projects and co-creating knowledge, generating these together. Recognizing the differences in how we conceptualize time, right? So in the academy, there's a lot of regimented time, right? Classes go at this amount. This is how much time we have for a meeting. Relationships, which is at the core of so much of this, take time, and they may take way more time than what an academic trajectory might want us to fit to. So making space for that, recognizing that those meetings and those relationships are core for decision making, and consensus is often the goal of that decision-making process. This is not about voting, right? How majority voting. This is about coming together and having those important conversations, making sure that we're respecting time, compensating and hiring Indigenous folks as much as possible. And then the final point on here, which I think is really key to what we're trying to get at today, is sustainability. So how do we ensure that these data are never lost? They're never sort of gone behind these gates that are no longer accessible to community. How do we build sustainable relationships? How do we build sustainable data access? Next slide, please, Andrew. So those are some of the principles. Now, how? And this is the big question of a lot of these working tools seminars, is how do we actually do this? And what are some of these key requirements for ensuring data is shared in the appropriate ways? So one is that it can hold all of the objects of data, right? We have so many different forms of data that are generated through our work. We have GIS data, we have PDFs of reports, we have the belongings themselves, we have the research papers. We need to be able to have comprehensiveness to hold all these different data objects. needs to be accessible to a wide range of users. So not requiring a specific training that might be expensive. It might, having accessibility to people relatively intuitively, right? So that they can make sense of it. That it's easily searchable and easy to locate specific data, both through entering of search terms, but also through data browsing, so that there's an intuitiveness to the ways in which people find and locate data, that it's not, again, buried in some obscure recording system or only under sort of certain types of structures that make it difficult to locate. It has a low cost so that we're not requiring expensive software solutions for users, that there's layers of security, and that security and accessibility are decided in close collaboration with communities, because different communities will want different types of information accessed by different people. And so building in the security so that the data that needs to be behind those firewalls, behind those protected spaces is secure. And then that access is mediated in appropriate ways. It needs to have capacity and scalability. So again, Stephanie was telling us about the complexities of Metlakatla's data. We need to be able to have tools that scale up but also can scale down as needed and can be deployed in different ways, and that have a public face as appropriate. So next slide, please, Andrew. So we wanted to briefly review some of the existing platforms that we have used in different sorts of ways, or that that different researchers and communities may use in different sorts of ways, and then that will lead us into why Tasa came to be, and what some of these issues are. So we're all familiar with sort of folder hierarchies, because that's a lot of the ways in which we learn to engage with computers, and these are now being duplicated on the cloud, right? So we have cloud solutions, but they're within these sort of standard folder hierarchies. They're difficult to maintain. They're not easy to search, right? And they're not very secure. So this is not an ideal solution. They can hold a lot of data objects, but you can't really find or engage with them in very many ways, other than in sort of like a file structure format. There are, of course, many database apps as well. Some of these are very expensive. Many of them, especially from the back end, have very steep learning curves. So to actually customize and create the necessary tools, that requires specialized knowledge and specialized resources, which may not be accessible. The same is true of a GIS. A GIS can be powerful as a spatial archive and can bring in different forms of data objects, but it's designed best for spatial data and often requires quite a steep learning curve as well. There are sort of public-facing GIS solutions, and these are sort of these mapping platforms, Google Maps, Google Earth, things like this, but they have limited database functionality. They don't actually allow you to hold all the data objects that are necessary for the type of work that we do. And then website platforms can have similar challenges in terms of limited functionality, a lot of back-end work sometimes needing to be done, and often there can be security issues with websites and how digital media might circulate from that. Next slide, please, Andrew. Is he still there? Andrew, are you still with us?
I am. I'm just trying to get it to turn. Sorry. Not sure what's going on. Oh dear. Encountered a technical glitch. Oh, there we are.
There we go. Okay.
Sorry. Okay, we'll go this way.
So we created a table that just sort of summarizes some of the points that I made on the previous slide. So I'm not going to belabor this too much, but it's a way to kind of track some of the different elements of each of these possible solutions and demonstrate where they kind of map onto that. The main takeaway is that there's not actually any one that has all of the high kind of categories that are needed. So some of them have high cost or moderate. So we need to be able to map something that meets all the necessary components. So that has high comprehensiveness, accessibility, searchability, low cost, high security, high stratified access, high capacity, and an ability to manipulate the public face, right? So to make it accessible in different ways. Let's move to slide 16, please, Andrew. So as this slide sort of demonstrates, many researchers and research community partnerships and communities themselves default to a range of tools. We use whole different types of things. So we have our cloud services like our Dropbox or our Google Drive that have a lot of information within them. But that's only one set of data, right? So we can move on to 18, Andrew. And then we have used Google Earth, for example, to do things like create points where different sites are. You can add information to those points. You can sometimes add images, but it's not comprehensive, right? It doesn't allow us to bring in all those data objects that we would like. Next one, please, Andrew. And then, of course, this is my wheelhouse, which is GIS. So there are ways to get open access GIS. This is QGIS, which we have here, but it does have quite a learning curve. The way that GISs query and bring data into them requires quite a bit of learning. They're not particularly intuitive when you first encounter them. And so that can be definitely an issue as well. So inaccessibility can sometimes be cost related, but it's also about those sort of steep learning curves. So next slide, please, Andrew. I think this is my last one. So to summarize sort of these issues, we know that data sharing and knowledge co-production are really important, but existing platforms do not meet all the criteria that are needed. They're inaccessible, they are encoded or hard to access, hard to manipulate and search, or they don't have the data storage capacity that is required. And so to try to meet some of these needs, what Andrew's going to talk about is a spatial system that is easy to use, secure, flexible, and that doesn't have encoded indexing, meaning that we can engage with it and search it in important ways. And so the solution that we've provided, which again, coming back to what Stephanie said, is just the tip of the iceberg, is a bespoke spatial archive. So a spatial archive with the necessary capacity to meet some of these needs. So I'm now going to turn the screen and the mic over to Andrew to take us through Tasa and provide a short demo.
This is the main interface of the project. It's a secure system. It's limited number of users can access this. There are security levels within it, but it's really secure by the fact that not very many people have access to it. I think there's maybe 3 or 4 who work with this particular system. If there is sort of an insight that we're building into the program, it's that the index of data is through the landscape. We're not trying to encode information other than in a way that many people are already familiar with culture and history, and that is across landscape. So the landscape, the map, acts as the main index to information. So it's not an output, it's the way that people experience information, which we like to think kind of mimics how we understand data itself. It's got 3 panels, the layers, which is just a folder hierarchy on the left, the main interface, it's a Google Earth engine, or a Google Maps engine, so you can flip back and forth between the satellite and the map interface. And then, as you'll see, a third panel opens up with data objects that we can investigate. Let's take a look at some of these. We have I'm not going to show you the Adele, but we'll take the archaeological data sets and we'll take a look at some common kinds of data that archaeologists produce. Here's an output. This is actually a raster or an image. It's what we call an overlay in this system. It's really an output from a GIS of data from RAD, from the remote access to archaeological data of the BC Heritage Branch, dated in February. This was from RAD 2, which I never figured out how to use, but I got the database through RAD and was able to project it into a GIS. And this is Tasa accommodates the data from a GIS. So GISs can produce, as Keisha said, wonderful data sets, create spatial cartography, and then the outputs of that can be accommodated within Tasa. It's not a GIS, and it doesn't pretend to be a GIS, but it can accommodate some of the outputs of a GIS. So this is really just a picture of dots, which is useful, but limited. So let's take a look at some of these other data points here. I'm just going to bring some of these guys up. And if we zoom in to this set of data points, this is a set of data points around Metlakatla. I'm just going to zoom in, sorry for dancing around. And you can see that each of these points actually is not just an image, but in fact, a hot button, a button that signals and points to other sets of data. Archaeologists encode the heritage landscape in terms of a concept called a site, and in the Heritage Conservation Act and the management of that heritage through the BC archaeology branch, the concept of a site then requires a designation and a site form. And they're encoded using this language created by Charles Borden, the Borden system. And I don't know about you, but if you're an archaeologist, I can't keep these things straight myself. So I remember where I've been. I don't remember the codes that even I'm supposed to use. So this is a way of finding information that is more accessible, I think, and than just trying to memorize indexes and archival systems of dealing with and sorting knowledge. Let's just take a look. Here's one. If I click on these buttons, then I'm going to get a site map. And I'm going to get the site forms that are part of the government's record of these places. Keeping track of all of this information can be a chore for anybody. I find that I return to Tasa all the time to find data, again, because it's encoded in ways that I don't comfortably find at my fingertips, whereas this system of maps allows me to locate that information quite comfortably. Let's take a look at another set of data. So overlays on large sort of regional data sets are useful, but let's take a peek at something a little bit closer to sort of the scale that a lot of archaeologists work at. Here's a map of a landscape near Prince Rupert. It's a famous site. You perhaps have heard of it. It's called Boardwalk. And this is a map that was produced in the 1990s by Gary Copeland and colleagues based on research that had been conducted at this site since the 1960s. So there's an enormous amount of archaeological data compiled at this one place. And sadly, it's not terribly well organized. It's difficult for even experts to figure out what happened here. So we're trying our best to reconstruct an accessible framework so that others without necessarily advanced degrees in archival studies can understand what happened here and make some sense of what it is that the archaeologists discovered. You'll see a few things occur. First of all, if we click on the PDF button, we're going to get the field notes. This was from the Canadian Museum of Civilization before it became the Canadian Museum of History. There's their field notes and a little report by Richard Inglis, who worked with George MacDonald on this project. You can also take a look at the map. Not only contains the drawings, which are geo-referenced. So this is another GIS output. We take the image, locate it correctly on the Earth's surface through a process called geo-referencing, which is quite straightforward. It skews and tilts and rotates the image so that it's correctly placed on the Earth's surface, and then we can project it into the GIS and then ultimately into Tasa. We not only have that drawing, but we also have these little lines here. In fact, what those lines are hot link buttons themselves. And if you click on them, you can hopefully see a little bit in the corner. That's an excavation profile from the 1970s, and I can zoom around and take a peek at all of these little profiles. Whoops, pushed the wrong button there. I can peek at these little profiles. There we go. Oh, I've lost my button. Well, there we go. There's the profile showing up, and I can scoot around. Oh, it's not showing up. My button there. I can take a quick browse of the data, and again, we're trying to break down the barriers by which archaeologists and others encode information to let people inspect this information. And the truth is that archaeology is not particularly complicated. It encodes data in complicated ways, but a preliminary inspection of evidence is often quite accessible. So this is an opportunity to see that. On top of this, I can overlay this drawing, which is from 2017, a paper that Bryn Letham and I worked on, and a few others. And you can see that the map of 2017 fits comfortably on top of the map of back in the 1970s, produced in the 90s from data from the 70s. And again, those hot link buttons of locations within the system are preserved and retained. So we can start comparing data sets of different times and different researchers to each other. And that can be productive without really having to scratch our heads too hard or pull our hair out. We can start to see patterns in data sets that in a way that's a little bit more accessible than, let's say, reading an 1100-page report. Here's just another little button that shows you there's the article from which this information comes. So you can use this system to kind of cluster data together that might be relevant to the researcher or to the person who's just investigating it. Well, anybody looking at this kind of stuff is going to have some kind of a research interest, no matter what community they're coming to the data from. So there's an example. Let's just take a peek at another case over here. Let's go over to this site. Here is a regional map of the area. You can see another overlay projected from GIS onto the landscape. This is one from some of our recent work. And in it, we can take a look at this map. This is a map of a location in the harbor. I'm not going to reveal that location for confidentiality reasons, but you can see that the map, this is from David Archer's work in the 1980s, showing this landscape. If we get rid of it, you can see the satellite photograph and then the map on top of it. And then here's my recent data set. So you can start compiling data sets in these layers on top of each other, much like a GIS does, but in the absence of some of the learning challenges that I find myself, I have with GISs. I'm not, unlike Keisha, I'm not an expert in GIS. There's one other thing I want to just show you. I'm going to show you, but not show you. There's some pictures. That little icon shows you there's a photograph. And this little icon shows you that there's a 3-dimensional PDF right over here, which I'm going to turn off. And those, a 3-dimensional PDF is a digital object, a 3-dimensional image, in this case of an important area of rock art. I'm not going to reveal it to you for confidentiality reasons, but when we built Tasa and Mausa, I didn't even know 3-dimensional PDFs existed. Perhaps they did, perhaps they didn't. But the system can accommodate any kind of new digital object, and that's useful. It can scale around. And I just want to show you, in case you haven't seen a 3-dimensional PDF, here's a 3-dimensional PDF, not from the Tsimshian culture history, but actually sort of, I think it's late 20th century from Muncie, Indiana. Yes, that is in fact a 3-dimensional sculpture of Bob Ross, the famous painter, television personality. And it's a 3D PDF, which is kind of fun. We can do this with rock art, and it really is wonderful because it allows us to collect data on a 3-dimensional surface relatively quickly. I put this together, to be honest, in about 20 minutes this morning. This is not just I don't just have a bust of Bob Ross. It's actually a chia pet. You can give Bob Ross a verdant afro if you wish. I haven't in this case. But my point is that this digital object, which is kind of fun to fool around with, is a really useful tool in archaeological data that can bring the knowledge that archaeologists encounter on the landscape to people in the community more quickly and more effectively than other systems might. So it's a way of creating a kind of an inventory of digital data that is more meaningful, I think, and more accessible. Let's take a look at one last place that I want to just show you before I tell you about how it's not working in this system. There's some things that aren't working. Let's take a look at another location on the landscape. There's another site. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about the location. There's David Archer's map. This one's from about 1990 when he did survey work through there. So these are excellent maps. He was a wonderful cartographer and a great archaeologist. I mean, he still is. He's still around. Here's a data set that we can put on top of it. This is actually generated by LiDAR. So this is a 3-dimensional digital elevation model of the Earth's surface taken through actually a consulting company. And we got access to it through the good graces of Metlakatla First Nation, who allowed us to use it. We've used it very effectively to identify sites and to identify data within sites. We've actually been able to go and correct a lot of the RAD data, which misplaced their understanding of the heritage landscape of the 9 tribes as a result. So you can see kind of these massive islands of shell. This is an example actually of a 3-dimensional space written in 2 dimensions here of kind of the challenges that we face in archaeology of this landscape. These sites are hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of material, mostly shell and other things. And they're often 5 or 6 meters thick. This site contains material components going back over 5,500 years, right up to contemporary times. So it's a huge space. We can't really explore it through excavation. So instead, these little points are all percussion cores. They're places where we're using a much more limited and a much less destructive technique to explore the subsurface, ways to explore the history of this landscape without damaging the landscape to the same extent. It's destructive, but much more moderately so. And it's a way of kind of exploring this kind of place. Here's our more recent map on top of it. So again, you can compare different data sets to each other. I just want to zoom into this one. In fact, there's a little bit of a glitch in the system. I'm just going to scoot over here for a second, and then I'm going to go back. And then I'm going to go down here, and I apologize. We'll go back to that map right here. So this is one of the structures within that previous site. And I've just zoomed in on it now. So we're dealing with something that's about 5 by 10 meters in diameter from that regional view. And this is a polygon showing a 3-dimensional contour image showing a surface contour. And then these dots are the core tests. If we take a look at them, we can signal these buttons. We can pop up each of the core tests in this row. And if we click on those buttons, what we get is a schematic of that percussion core so that you can inspect the data. If I clicked on it, you get a big picture of it, but it would distract us from what we're doing. But the image of that percussion core is visible in a standardized format that we use. And below, there's a link to the spreadsheet that you can download and get in and take a look at that has more comprehensive data. The data from which we built the image is in the spreadsheet. We're actually missing the third piece, which is a high resolution photograph of the core itself. We were in the process of doing that when the pandemic hit. So this is an example of our work from 2019 that was getting into the system in early 2020. Again, so that Stephanie and her office and others in the community can get access to the data as we're producing it in the lab. It becomes our repository for storage so that the community can investigate what we're doing and monitor as we go. I just want to give you a quick peek at another thing. This is part of a research, so we're not just investigating these sites, but testing technique. We're trying to use this percussion coring tool to reproduce what we might otherwise do in excavation. And this is actually a stratigraphic profile. Let me just click on it again. Oops, again, I'm getting a bit of a glitch here. There we go. This is a stratigraphic projection of the subsurface through the cores itself, an attempt at kind of mirroring what an excavation might have done. But this data was collected, I didn't collect it, it was collected by Colin Greer and Liam Woodsworth and others. Bryn was there, Gary Copeland, Catherine Patton. I was not in the field because of an accident that I had, but they collected these data and were able to try and mimic what we might see in an excavation. These data were collected in a matter of a day or so, rather than the decade it would take us to excavate down to these great depths. So it gives you a sense of some of the ways that we can kind of showcase the methodological experiments that we're engaging in, the efforts of research to advance the purpose of better understanding this archaeological landscape. Lastly, I just want to show you that it's not just percussion coring that we're dealing with, but we're actually engaging in things like remote sensing. So this is a radargram, if I can get it to work. This is a radargram and a magnetometric profile, in this case, of the other axis of the house. And here's an example of how you can kind of, we can project data sets that might otherwise be relatively inaccessible, but in this format become more meaningful, I think. You don't need to know a lot about ground penetrating radar or magnetometry to see that these profiles give you a picture of the subsurface that are meaningful. There's an article that goes with these, a chapter. And if you're looking at the chapter, you can follow along with this data set to better understand how we've gotten to where we are and how we've interpreted this physical landscape in terms of 9 tribes history. So this is a little bit of an example. We can also do 3-dimensional, 2-dimensional overlays. Here's a different view of the radar data, a time slice, what's called a time slice, which is a projection of the anomalies of the radar within the house surface, an attempt to kind of, we think, and this is really the methodological question, are we seeing the house floors? Are we capturing some of the features that we might otherwise only encounter through excavation? And here's a lower projection of that data set. Again, these are described in an article, which you can track down through this system. And lastly, a bit of a magnetometric stuff. I was not involved in one of these as I was in the field. This is Liam Wadsworth's work, and Colin was involved as well. So, but an example of how we can combine different data sets together in a relatively seamless and a more accessible way. You don't have to have expertise in any one of these techniques, I think, to find meaning and at least some value and some insight into what the purpose of these techniques were and what some of the preliminary results might offer. So those are some examples of what we might do. I just want to show you before I finish some of the things that it doesn't do very well. It does have belonging photographs, so we can place belongings. We don't encounter many belongings in our work. We're mostly doing these remote sensing and sort of digital efforts, but occasionally in the beach forms eroding out of sites, we find belongings. And so we've been able to take an inventory of photographs of these belongings and geotag them to the locations on the beaches where they come from. So you can do, to some extent, analyses of material culture in the beach fronts of these locations. But I don't want to spend time exploring that because we're running short. I just want to show you something that doesn't work very well. And it's important to know some of the limitations. Some of the data that archaeologists encounter are not particularly well mediated by space. The idea of a landscape giving us the index to data is useful for certain kinds of data, but not so good for others. And here's an example of a set of project reports from consultants that is mediated by space. This is the Millennia Consulting Company, and they're working here in the container ports. But if we take a look instead at David Archer's work, and he was all over the landscape, there isn't really a good polygon that represents his extraordinary research. So it's hard to kind of find a way sometimes to get thematic data and regional data to have a cartographic imprint, to find a way to encode it. And we're still puzzling our way through this. The last example I'll give you of this is Ken Ames's work. Ken Ames did a research at one site for his PhD, and there it is. Oops, I'm just gonna try and I gotta turn some of these things off for it to work. Forgive me. Turn that off. Oh, I've got too many buttons turned on. That's the problem. You can get this way sometimes. You can turn on everything and then you can't select any one thing. So you have to tidy up as you go. Let me just do that and then I'll show you this example. So there's Ken Ames's He did his PhD on a single site. But of course, if anybody knows, if you know Ken Ames, his research was expansive. This polygon doesn't even do it justice. I don't even think we can find a polygon that would effectively create a spatial imprint for this inventory of scholarship. But it does give us access to an inventory of scholarship, which is useful if you just need to find what Ken Ames wrote on Tsimshian archaeology. The last piece I'll show you, I'm not going to show you, and that's the Tsimshian Ada, the oral record. Again, these are data that are mediated by space, represented in time, which we don't account for very well here, and often at specific locations, but we're still puzzling our way through finding better places to present this information and better ways to do so. So it's useful, but you should notice that there's one thing missing from this conversation, and that is there are no Metlakatla voices here. This is a one-way conversation of me and my archaeological colleagues providing information in a single direction to the community. I had hoped, and I imagine, I kind of hope that there might be a reciprocal conversation that returns, but we have not achieved that yet. And my ambition of sort of creating a space for somebody like Wayne and I to work together hasn't yet been fully realized, but it still remains a possibility. So currently Tasa is, I think, a useful middle space tool. It has some value. It fits into this sort of knowledge mobilization requirement. And I think it does some things effectively. It provides Stephanie and her office with reasonably quick access to data sets that might otherwise be difficult to locate and to place and to find their location and perhaps even their meanings of. But it is largely a discipline-bound archaeological projection and not a conversation with people from the 9 tribes. I think it might become so, but it isn't there yet. Really, it's limited to people who are researching, and so there is no public face, there's no engagement of others who might have an interest in this research. It's restricted to, as I say, right now about 4 people. We don't yet have a capacity to broaden that conversation given the confidential nature of some of the data. It certainly wouldn't be my role to find that audience, but it lacks that sort of limited security access. It's very much an office-to-office tool between a research office and the heritage office in Metlakatla, from the university to the heritage office. And so it doesn't quite achieve this knowledge co-production ambition that benefits from reciprocal research capacity. It doesn't quite overcome the structural inequalities that are implicit in university-based research. And it, as Keisha mentioned, partly that's just a constraint of university-based research, but we can, I think, do better. And this is a project which, kind of like a lot of university research within Indigenous communities, sort of works. And that's probably should be the title of my next article. It sort of works. It doesn't quite work. It doesn't achieve what it should, but it takes a positive step in a useful direction. So my conclusion and our conclusion really is that knowledge co-production, as essential as it is, mandated by our ethical and our ethical principles, enshrined in ethical standards of universities, framed in our funding agencies. The Tri-Council identifies knowledge mobilization and co-production as a key piece of funded research, is very difficult to effectively achieve. You can do some service towards it, but true knowledge co-production remains quite elusive. And we haven't yet, I think, done much other than, as Stephanie said, scratch the tip of the iceberg. All right, thank you very much.